and welcome to Writer of the Week. Today we're here with Donna Figurski, author of the award-winning book Prisoners Without Bars, A Caregiver's Tale. She writes an award-winning blog on brain injury, which can be found at survivingtraumaticbraininjury.com. She's also a host of a twice-monthly radio show on the Brain Injury Radio Network at blogtalkradio.com/brain injury radio. Welcome, Donna. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Hi, Melissa. How are you?
Good. So I understand you're going to do an excerpt reading for us today?
Yes, I'd love to. I'm going to be doing a reading from my book, Prisoners Without Bars. You can see it behind me, but this is the actual book. And it's going to be from chapter 22. It was weird living in a hospital for 12 to 14 hours a day. I never left, not even to go outside for a breath of air. To do so would have meant strapping David to his bed. Even when I had to use the restroom, I timed my trip to correspond with David's therapy. Occasionally, I'd need to leave his room. Then I'd slip next to David's bed, talking to distract him, and tie the straps of his posy to the bars beneath the bed. Though I tried to do it covertly, David recently told me that he knew what I was doing. As David was confined to bed, I was confined to his hospital room. One thing I know about myself is that I can never be idle. I'm always working on projects. I especially needed to be busy during this time to flood my mind with stuff so that I could avoid thinking. Thinking deeply about David's plight would have been unbearable, which in turn would have made me miserable. I would have resented the horror that had happened to us, even though David alone must suffer the bodily trauma. The emotional trauma has befallen us both. If I had permitted myself to think about our future, or lack of it, I know I may have become resentful and depressed. I longed for our perfect life to be returned to us. I wished somehow that I were able to turn back the hands of the clock on that fateful morning of January 13th. And I questioned if only David had awakened late that morning and hadn't had time to do his exercises. If only he had done only 12 chin-ups instead of the hated 13. Would he have been okay? Would our lives have remained the same? Even now, my questions remain unanswered, and they haunt me daily. The doctors said that David had harbored a time bomb in his head. They said the bleed, a subarachnoid hemorrhage, could have happened at any time. And I can't help but wish that it had waited until David was 80 or 90 years old. Later would have been better. The TBI would not have stripped David of his relative youth and ripped away our lives. He was in the prime, a respected Columbia professor, internationally known in his field of molecular biology. But his brain did bleed, and I was grateful that David had been home and that I too had been home. Other scenarios would have presented more dire outcomes. I couldn't even think about how he might have been driving on the highway to Columbia, or how he might have been alone in his lab before his students arrived. Both of these imply a deadly outcome or more serious complications. So when I examined the other possibilities, I knew we had been fortunate. Whenever I felt sad about our situation, and I did often enough, I reminded myself of my pleas to each doctor who performed a surgery on David. I don't care how you give him back to me, I'd beg. Just give him back to me. I am thankful each day that David fought the odds to stay with me and that he continues to live and breathe and seize his life. And I am grateful to his doctors for doing their jobs well. I brought my laptop to David's room each day. It prevented me from playing the what-if game. What if I hadn't been home to call the ambulance? What if his first surgery had been unsuccessful as predicted, or his second, or his third? What if? What if? The what ifs can go on endlessly, and they do no good at all. Asking what if would not change my reality. My work kept me from drifting to places that were too dark. It kept me from dwelling on what was no more. It kept me focused and in the present and with hope for the future. I tried to keep current with my email, which was overflowing and kept me overly busy. Since my evenings had so few hours, I began to write David updates during the day while David slept. Family and friends eagerly awaited these missives to follow his progress. I wrote about each tiny accomplishment. I rarely wrote about the failures, the problems, or my fears. I shared only gains, offering hope, conveying only that David was getting better. I needed to believe that. Looking back, I wonder if that was fair. Fair to David, fair to our family and friends, or more importantly, fair to me. I think I focused on David's achievements because, to me, they meant he was getting better. I knew if I acknowledged his failures, his lack of substantial improvement, I couldn't sustain the strength I needed to weather this trauma. Then, on March 1st, a milestone. David could breathe completely on his own, and his trach was removed. I finally heard the much-coveted words, "I love you." Words I'd longed to hear for more than 6 weeks. David's voice was scratchy, and his words were garbled and difficult to understand. But I didn't care. Now we could talk. We were finally moving forward.
So when did you decide to write this book?
Well, that's interesting because I really never planned to write a book about our incident that happened. I usually wrote children's picture book manuscripts, and I had been doing that for some 10, 15 years and sending them out and trying to get them published. And so it was never on my radar to write a book about David's event that had happened. But when I had taken classes, I'm just going to go back a little history of this. When I had taken classes at Columbia Teachers College in some summer, I don't know when, in the 90s, I guess, and my instructor, and we were writing picture books, we were writing for children, and my instructors had all encouraged me to send my work to the publishers. And my fellow teachers also encouraged me to do that. So I sent my first manuscript, Too Many Bubbles, to the publishers with a lot of trepidation and a lot of naivety. I didn't know what I was getting into at that point. But for about 15 years, I submitted, maybe 15 manuscripts to the various publishers. And usually I would get a response saying, "Dear author, signed the editor," which is your typical rejection letter. I have a huge collection of those. So, but I'm proud of them because that means somebody has, looked at my work, and even if they didn't want it at that particular time, it was good. But there is one, the editor rejection letters. I also I also received many encouraging letters from the editors, and they weren't signed or said "Dear Author." It was "Dear Donna," and it was ending with the editor's name, which was very good. And inside that letter would be some words of encouragement, and I'm going to just tell you a couple of them because they kind of float around my head and try to keep encouraging me to do that. But some of the editors, I have them listed on one of my blog pages. I have a lot of them. But one of the editors wrote, "I think this is the strongest piece you have sent me. It's funny and charming and a story your children will relate to well. But," the next one, "Molly and Oliver are endearing characters and you have a nice sense of their age group. But you write well, no question there. But." And so on my blog page, it's called my "but" page. So there are about 25 or 20 to 30 something of those little snippets out of the different letters that I had received. So had David not had his brain injury, I'd probably still be writing those manuscripts and still be trying to get them published. But in 2005, when my husband David had a traumatic brain injury, I was stopped dead in my tracks with everything, pretty much everything, but definitely with my writing for children. And now my writing for children just went on the back burner, and I haven't done much with it until last summer. I started up again, taking classes again and resending some things. The field has changed drastically, so I've got a huge job in front of myself, but it'll get done eventually. But as I said earlier, I never intended to write a book for adults. And even after David's brain injury, that thought still held true. I never had a thought to do that. In the hospital, in the NICU, the Neurological Intensive Care Unit, I did feel a need to write a pamphlet. I thought perhaps maybe I could do that for people in need, and just outline, like oftentimes you see in doctor's office, you see the Alzheimer's pamphlets or the diabetes pamphlets or Parkinson's disease, and it gives you little snippets of what to expect with that. But there's never anything for brain injury, and I feel that that's really remiss. And so I thought that's what I should do when I get done with everything and have some time again. Well, 14 years later, I still haven't found that time. But so anyhow, that is what was my main goal. And they say that you should have that you should follow the 3 P's to get a book published, and that is persistence, patience, and perseverance. And I think at that point, I think I must have all of those, because I began writing David's book in 2006, a year after his event. And it wasn't until 2013 that I actually put the end at the end of the chapter, the last chapter. And that was something like 76 chapters. It's not that now. It's been renumbered. But so with that, and then I sold it in 2017, and it wasn't published until November 2018. So I think, yes, I definitely qualify for the persistence, patience, and the perseverance, because that took a very, very long time to do. But I got it done. I actually got it done. But not much. The reason I did that too was, well, again, I wasn't expecting to write for adults. So what I did was, I was writing the updates, as I mentioned in my excerpt. I was writing David's updates, but also while I was in the hospital, I had been doing digital recordings of everything that a doctor had said to me, or a nurse, or anybody therapy. Any notes that they were giving me, I would go after I spoke to them and go to the corner and then digitally record what they said, so that I would have accurate information to put in the updates. So what happened was, when David was home now from the hospital, and he would be going to bed at 8:30, very early, and I would start to write. And I was just writing for me, but I was using that update, all the update information and the digital recording information, because I had it all accurate there. So I was putting it together as a story to kind of chronicle, I guess, what we had been through. And eventually it just turned into a book, and I'm like, wow. And I continued. Once I realized it was a book, I just continued working on it until that 2013 date, when I completed it, and then started to think about sending it out. But I wrote it for all those people who have a brain injury, or for those who will have a brain injury. And of course, for their families, their caregivers, their friends, anybody that is has any interest in brain injury. It's good. It's a good read for them too. And it's not all dire, it's very funny. I mean, there are a lot of very funny parts in it.
And what is the significance of the title?
The title, well, the title morphed through a lot of different titles before it actually came to Prisoners Without Bars. First, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but it was like surviving traumatic brain injury was my first title. Very mundane, very simple. But as I was talking with different people about it in my writing group or different people in the field, it just kept changing. And so at one point, I decided when I was reading reading over some of my book, I realized there is a line in there that says prisoners without bars. And I thought, whoa, that's kind of exactly what this is. It's a prisoner without bars. David is the prisoner, and the title was Prisoner Without Bars. So then I went to a writing conference, and an agent was talking with me about the book, and as I gave her some feedback on it, she said, nope, that's not the title of your book. And I said, well, yeah, it's about my husband. And she said, no, it's not about your husband. It's about you. And the title should be Prisoners Without Bars. And I said, no, it's not about me. It's about David. I'm writing his story. And she insisted that it was about me. So when I went home and told David and talked to him about it, he agreed it right away, readily. He said, yeah, this is about you. And Prisoners Without Bars is the title that should be on the book. Now, it took a little convincing, but I finally agreed, and I do believe in it now. I do think that it is about, a lot about me. It's David's story, but it's through my eyes as a caregiver. So it gives not only the factual details, but it also gives a lot of emotional thoughts and feelings behind the text in the book.
Was there anything that surprised you in the process of writing it?
Well, yeah, there were a couple of things, and one of the biggest things was what I just talked to you about. That was a huge surprise to me. I just did not think that this was a book about me in any way. I did not think it was a caregiver's tale. So that was a huge surprise right off the bat. And then the other one that I felt as I finally found the right publisher for this book, and I'll tell you, it's Right Life Publishing, and they're an imprint of Boutique of Quality Books, BQB. I know the letters, but the other one evaded me for a second. But no, and they were amazing, and I really wanted to. Well, I'll get into that later, but they were amazing. And what I really, really liked was the personal effect of that company. The president of the company called me and talked to me about my book. I had a lot of input in the whole book. So those are the two things that really were my biggest surprises, I think.
And what was your experience with the method you chose to publish? It sounds like it was more a traditional publishing route instead of just hybrid.
Well, actually, I was going to talk about the fact that there is traditional, there is self-published, and there is hybrid. And they're all different modes of publishing a book, and I think that people have to choose which one works best for them. Now, for me, because of the children's picture books, I had always been going the traditional route. That's how I had always wanted to go, and so that's the way I went for several years. I would send out my book mostly now to agents, because you can't get in the front door of a publishing house anymore without the help of an agent. You can't get an agent anymore either without, I don't even know what. It's really, really difficult. But I was fortunate enough with Prisoners in the very beginning, and this is a little aside here, that when I did send it off to the first 8 agents, several of them wrote back, but one particular agent, and it was the same agent that told me about the title, wrote back and asked me for the entire manuscript. Eventually, over a little segments of time, she asked for the entire manuscript, and she loved it. She said it's a wild ride. She was amazed by it. And but then once we kept talking, after about a month, she felt that she wasn't able to rep it at that point because she didn't have the time. So a very, very discouraging, I was going to say few days. No, it was a lot of days that I was very upset about it. But it also had another chance at another publisher. This would be more a niche publisher, and that didn't work either. After the contract was signed on both parties, the publisher decided that isn't exactly what they wanted. and they asked me to write a different book. So I'm working on that in my spare time. With the traditional, it's nearly impossible to break in, as I just kind of mentioned. It's got limited marketing and promotion unless you are John Grisham or Judy Blume. You need an agent, like I said, and they're just as hard to find, and the royalties are much smaller there. Now, with self-published, there is no editing involved. You just put out whatever you want, and you can get your book self-published. And a lot of people do that because they want to write a history for their family, of their lives for their family or something like that. So there's definitely a place for the self-published books too. But there's no royalty, obviously. There's no marketing or promotion in self-published, and anyone, as I said, can self-publish, and there are no quality restrictions. So I was not apt to go self-published at all. That was never going to be my route. Of course, I said traditional was my first route. But when I realized that, this is taking forever, and I don't have forever to get this out anymore, So I looked at, actually David looked at things. He looked at hybrids. And the hybrid is a smaller form of the traditional. They have some different things going on with it. But the hybrid, I had a great editor. I had a great copy editor. I had great cover and internal book design, and I had input on all of that. Like, I got to choose which cover got on this book. Now they chose the font and everything, and actually it was rechanged at one point because when it went on Amazon it didn't look so great, so they changed it. But with my input, that's how that cover came to be. So I had the choice in all the facets of the entire book, the font, where my name was positioned on the book, where the grayscale mountains in the beginnings of the chapters. So and also they have a much higher royalty. We split 50-50. You can't go better than that, I don't think. I mean, maybe you can, but I'm happy with 50-50. Now, for that, yes, they do charge you a fee to start it, and it's based on how well your manuscript is to begin with. My manuscript is in very good shape, so I came down in the very, very low level of what I had to pay. So I was delighted with them, and because of the personal attention, I can email the publisher, the president of the company, anytime, and she'll get back to me. She offers promotional webinars every month, and I haven't missed any because that's how I want to learn how I can better promote my book. So I think that for all of those reasons, that's how I chose to go with the hybrid, and I would definitely do that with the next book I'm working on, which is about my teaching career.
And how did you manage to do everything you had to do, especially in the beginning when things were really tough? What is your responsibility load like now?
Okay. Wow. When everything happened in the very, very beginning, I just put one foot in front of the other. Basically that's all you can do. You can just only live in the actual moment. You can't much think about ahead of time because you don't know what the future is going to bring. I was living every single day, every moment, every minute, wondering if David was going to survive. So I only could deal with being with him, and I couldn't leave his side. I would leave. I said in the thing I was there for 12 to 14 hours. So I'd go home, and I didn't go home. Actually, the first few nights when it first happened, I just spent the nights in the hospital. And then eventually when I had David move to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, his chairman of his department got me a room in one of the student housing, a suite actually, so that a lot of my family stayed with me. But that was only a block away from the hospital, so that worked out really, really nicely because otherwise it would have been about an hour commute to get over there every time. So I was able to spend all that time and then just go home to sleep and shower and come back to the hospital. So so what did I do other than just keeping one foot in front of the other? I also was like an ostrich. Like I always refer to it as the Energizer ostrich. I kind of kept my head in the sand. I didn't think further about what was going on. I didn't want to know what was happening. I just focused on the moment, and I kept busy. Again, as I mentioned in that, I'm not very idle very often, so I just kept busy no matter what. And when the hospital, I was talking to David constantly, even though he was in a coma, I still talked to him all the time. Whether he could hear me or not, I was talking, and because I was trying to reach through to him in some way. And the other thing I did, and I was going to show this, but I didn't bring it over, was I used a notebook. I have got all these little tiny dollar store notebooks that were bound, and I kept that with me constantly, and dated every day. I would date it, and what I had to do, I would put down. So if I had to call the insurance company, I would write it down, what I did, what I had to talk about, put the time there too, and then once I, did that, I would check it off and say it was done. So if I had to, no matter what the task was, it went into that book. My entire life was in that book. And when each task was done, I checked it off. And when the page was done, I put a little star up on the top of the corner so that I knew that I never had to look at that page again. Because otherwise, I'd be reading it over constantly, and I wouldn't know what it was doing. And by getting rid of it that way, I still have a record of everything. Oh, I can't tell you how many books I filled. I just kept filling them and filling them. And once I started back to work, there was even more stuff that went into those books. But that was how I was able to keep myself organized, and that's how I managed to do what I had to do in the very beginning. And my responsibility now, it's changed. It's a little different because David is, more able to deal with a lot of stuff. He's able to get around the house by himself, although his balance is very severely challenged. He can get some meals for himself. I think he's out there doing that right now. So he's getting something to chomp on before we actually go have dinner. And, so he's able to dress himself. In the beginning, he was not able to do any of that stuff. He was so disabled. He was so needy that he couldn't do anything. So in essence, after about 5 years, I was able to go and leave him alone. And I did go back to the theater and started to work in the theater as stage managing, assistant stage managing, painting stage things, whatever. So I was starting to get out a little bit more that way. And it's continued on, to now. We're 14 years later. And yes, I can leave him alone, but we're always connected at the hip with our phones, our cell phones. If he ever needs me, I'm not that far away. I can get back really fast. Yeah.
So what and who are caregivers, and how can caregivers help their care recipients in both emotional and physical needs?
Wow. Caregivers are, I'm going to just tell you, I think everyone is a caregiver in some aspect or another. Because if you have ever, if you've ever been a mom, if you're a mom, if you're a dad, you are a caregiver. If you are a granny, obviously you get those grandchildren oftentimes. You are a caregiver. If you are a school teacher like I was, I cared for 25 to 27 children every year for 180 days. So that's a caregiver. But I think what we're talking about mostly here is a caregiver in the instance that I was a caregiver, or many people are caregivers because their care recipient has a serious illness or disease or something that is impacting their lives. So first off, I think caregivers are jugglers because they have to juggle not only their lives, but they have to juggle the lives of their care recipients. And usually that includes family and friends and just external doctor's appointments, etc. So I always like to say that caregivers are nurses. The first thing off, they are nurses, but very often without a degree. I didn't get a nursing degree for sure, but yet I was thrust into that position on April 1st, which I thought was a huge joke, that they sent David home. with a hole in his stomach and a G-peg, which is a place to feed David. You know, so I basically was able to pour food right into his stomach. I had to change dressings on his eye. I had to dole out medications, 15 of them, at least 15, throughout the day at different times. So yeah, I was wearing a nursing cap at that point. They're housekeepers. Many of us are housekeepers anyway, but you know, very often you're sharing a housekeeping job when you've got a home with a spouse or a partner, or if you're living in a family. You're not doing it all yourself. But when you become the caregiver, you're doing everything pretty much by yourself, especially when your care recipient is reduced to an infantile state and not able to do anything for himself. So there are also chauffeurs. Chauffeurs are the ones, I used to taxi David constantly to doctor appointments for his eye, for his neurologist, for all of his therapies that he had to do. So that was just something that you just do, you know. Now that's on top of everything that you're doing for yourself too. They're secretaries. You know, a secretary, oh wow, I had to take over all the bills. I never knew which was a bill that came in. I would simply collect the mail, put it on David's desk, and forget about it. I take all the good things out, like letters from my grandmother or something like that. But the bills and everything, even the junk mail, went onto David's desk, and he took care of that. So I had no idea how to do any of that. So I was thrust into that position. I was thrust into getting finding how to get money out of an ATM at that time. I didn't know how to do it. It's not David's fault. It's mine. I just refused to learn. He took me to the ATM so many times and said, "This is the PIN number. This is how you do it." Yeah, I figured I could just ask. You know, can you give me a 20? It was easier. So I did that, and I don't suggest that's a good idea for anybody. There are also chefs. In my home, I was the cook anyway, but for now, I had to change my cooking ways of doing things because David's diet was very restricted. He was on mushy foods. Think Jell-O or scrambled eggs or something like that. He was on liquids that had to be thickened every day. He couldn't drink anything. He couldn't drink just a pure water liquid or anything like that because he had swallow disorder. So I had to change over and do that sort of thing. And then, you know, I think one of the most important things that a caregiver can do for a care recipient is to be his or her cheerleader, because they need to be boosted on, I guess. You know, they need that encouragement that they are doing well, or finding something that is even little that's saying, yeah, you didn't do that yesterday, but look, you can do it today. That's really cool. So being excited over the small improvements. I had a friend that said, and I wrote this up on my blog one time, and Itty Bitty Giant Stuff, she said, I tied my shoe today, you know, and I was like, wow. Now, for most people, they'd say, well, so what? So you tied your shoe. But for somebody with a brain injury, that's huge. That's really big, you know, that's something that they weren't able to do before, and all of a sudden they're able, with a lot of practice, able to do. The one thing that got me really excited, well, not one, I mean, I'll tell you one, there are lots, but one thing that got me really excited is David and I, well, go back a second, David always did the laundry in our home. I made his clothes pink when I was first married, and therefore I didn't have to do the laundry anymore because he wasn't really too happy about pink t-shirts. So, but now when he is incapacitated like this, he's not able to do the laundry. So guess where it goes? Well, I'm not changing that much. I didn't put any reds in with whites, I will tell you that. But I still plopped everything in, you know. I'm not having time to separate like he does, five items to a machine load. That's not me. But no more pink, for sure. But so anyhow, I was doing the laundry for several years, and this particular morning, David was at the laundry machine, and he was doing some things there, and he dropped something, an item of clothing, on the floor. Now, remember, I said he was very balance challenged. He could barely walk. He couldn't walk on his own at that time at all. He was using a cane or a walker. And he was very balance challenged. So you can't do much at all that way. But he dropped an item and he bent down and picked it up. And I went, oh my gosh, that was absolutely huge, because bending down is takes an incredible amount of balance. And he was able to do it, and he got right back up. And I was so excited. So I think that those are the kinds of things that, for physical needs, that caregivers need to tune into. And for the emotional needs, I was, like I said before, I was dressing him, I was feeding him, I was helping him to walk, I was taking him around. Okay, I had to be an advocate for David while he was in a coma, because he was unable to do anything at all. He wasn't able to, he wasn't even able to talk at that point. He was trached. And he was in a coma much of the time. So I had to be the one that was telling people what he needed or what he didn't need in the case. I was the liaison from David to his doctors, his nurses, his therapists. And people in a coma need somebody to advocate for them. People not even in a coma, in the state that if they're in the hospital or even recovering at home, in a state such as David was in, you need somebody there to oversee what's going on. I advocated for all his insurance. He would never have been able to do any of that. I have no idea if David were living alone by himself and an insurance company sent something over, it would never have been taken care of. And I know that would be the case for many people. So I think that's really, important to make sure that you are there for the person in that capacity as well. When David was in a coma, I talked to him constantly, because even though people say people can't hear in a coma, I don't believe that. I've heard so many people say that they have heard, and in fact, David said he could hear my voice at times. He knew I was there, and that comforted him. He told me at one point that he wasn't worried about himself being in the state that he was in the hospital, mostly because he didn't understand it, but he also knew I was there. And he said, then I knew you would be taking care of things, so I felt safe. And so that, I think, is really important, to keep talking to your person, even if they're in a coma, and don't say things that you won't want them to hear. Like doctors oftentimes come in and say, no, it's really bad. His MRI showed this or that, and we're giving him really a very slim chance of living. You don't know what's being heard by your care recipient in a coma. So beware. Take those kinds of conversations to the hallway. I also played music for David while he was in coma. He was still while he was in the NICU, the neurological intensive care unit, hoping to break through, hoping that he'd hear the music, that maybe that would break him out of his deep sleep. And so I would put on the Stones. He loved the Stones. I put on the Righteous Brothers, a favorite song of ours, and would play that, so that he would, maybe hear that, and he'd get up and maybe he'd twist and shout on some of these things. It never happened, but I don't know. I was trying to reach him, so I just continued doing that. I do all the shopping for David. He sends me a needs list, his needs and his wants list. And his wants list is simply chocolate. That's what he wants all the time. So I go out and I always get him chocolate. It has to be 75% above cacao, but he gets chocolate. And mostly, I think you just have to be there for your care recipient. You just need to, show your positive attitude. Keep a smile on your face. I did that a lot. And that's, I think, another, I didn't like to show him my weaknesses because I was afraid it would impact him. So I think that kind of answers that.
So how are caregivers affected by their responsibilities, and how can other people make sure that they receive the support that they need?
Okay, so how are caregivers affected? Well, there are a lot of casualties. We call them casualties of caregivers. And one of the biggest ones, I think, is the emotional stress that it takes on a caregiver. When you're a caregiver, and as I was a 24/7 caregiver, in the very beginning years of David's injury. You know, I'm not sleeping well. I'm constantly on call. Even nurses, you know, are on call for so many, or they're working for so many hours, and then they get time off. But there was no time off because I had to be there for his needs, whatever he needed. And so there is a lot of emotional stress there. I did, again, with that Energizer ostrich, try to suppress it. You know, not think about it, just keep moving, going forward. There's the exhaustion. There's a ton, well, I mean, with the emotional stress comes that, you're just always on. But because of David's swallow disorder, he could easily choke on his own saliva. So when he was in bed, he would always be lying on the pillow, like at maybe a 45-degree angle, because he needed to be able to swallow properly. But he would choke. He would choke constantly, and that would it would wake me up, and I would be on high alert. Is he okay? What am I doing? Check him out. You know, sometimes he had night terrors, so I had to wake him up for those. So I really don't think I slept much the first 5 years. Yeah, very light sleep, but always immediately awake whenever he needed me. And it's interesting, even now to this day, whenever he has a bad night like that, I somehow can sense that he's having a bad time. And I wake up immediately, and it might be that mother instinct in you that, you know, as a mother of a small child, you wake up before the baby cries almost, you know, and that's almost kind of the same thing that's going on here. The anxiety that this whole thing caused, just knowing whether he was going to get better, what's happening next. The insurance company caused intense stress and anxiety because you never knew what they were going to pay for and what they weren't, and there were some major horrendous issues that I had to deal with and overcame them, but not without a lot of the stress and the exhaustion that goes with it. Depression. You know, very often people can become depressed. Again, that's why I kept overly busy, because if I stopped to think, yes, that would have happened to me. There's no question it would happen to me. I don't think it did happen to me because I was fortunate enough to just keep busy. So, but then there's the guilt. You've also got the guilt that's going on. You know, what if I had called the paramedics 2 minutes sooner? What if you know, that goes back to those what if questions. What if whatever, you know, what if I did something differently? Would it have been better, you know? And we'll never know those answers. So the guilt goes along with it, but you kind of want to kind of suppress it, get rid of it, because it's not anybody's fault. It wasn't David's fault. I mean, he did the 13th chin-up, but he didn't know that was going to cause his life to change. He did it because he was trying to improve his health. He was trying to, you know, improve himself. So, you know, you can't do the what if game. We've already talked about that. You can as a caregiver, your immune system is reduced because you're so exhausted. So poor physical health comes from that. Increased chronic disease comes from that, and many people have that. And much of the things I just mentioned fall into the Kubler-Ross model of grief. Of how to get through grief when somebody dies. And it's very similar because, in essence, I lost the man that I was married to, and I have a new man here with me. I really love this new guy, but I also love the old guy, you know? So if the old guy, you know, came back, I don't know what I would do because I like this new one too. So David has a solution for that, though. He says, look, Donna, if the old guy comes back, tell him to get lost. He said he left. It's his problem. Goodbye. So I think that's a good attitude that he has. But with Kubler-Ross, she talks about denial. Yeah, well, I think, you know, I was going through denial. I didn't want to think about it. Kept my head in the sand. She talks about the anger. There were times, yeah, I pounded the steering wheel a few times and cried in the shower. But it doesn't do any good, you know, it really doesn't. It might release your emotions for a little bit. You might feel that bargaining or guilt again, doesn't do much good. The depression, we talked about that, and the acceptance. And so I think that's where David and I both went to eventually. We are at the acceptance. After 14 years, I know our lives are not going back to our pre-trauma time. But acceptance doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean not doing anything to keep working forward and to trying to improve your situation. It just means that you're accepting your new normal, and you're going to embrace that new normal and do what you can to make this new life with this new guy I've got here, make it as good as it can be. And I think David and I work on that every single day. And, I'm just glad when I said to the doctors, just give him back to me. I don't care how you give him back to me, just give him back. I still hold true to that, and I'm so grateful that I still have him.
And who are your readers, and what do you want their takeaway message to be from Prisoners Without Bars?
Well, I think the readers, I wrote this book not only for survivors and caregivers and their families and friends. I also wrote the book with the thought in mind that, there are so many people that that have brain injury or are going to have brain injury because it is so prevalent. So I think that it's a book that anybody can read. The general public can read it and enjoy it. It's kind of a human interest story, and it takes you through it takes you through a year and a half of David's and my life together as immediately after his brain injury, and it takes you to, and then we also have the afterword and the epilogues that will bring you up to date to the year of 2017 when it was published. So I really think that the book is written for anybody who wants to read it. I think you would get something out of it. For caregivers, for sure, because I think it will offer them hope. I think it'll even for survivors, it will offer them hope as well. For people that don't know anything about brain injury, I think this is a book that will really give them a glimpse into what happens to somebody that has a brain injury and what they might expect if a family member or a friend ends up having a brain injury. It gives a lot of insight into that, and it also gives a lot of insight into the caregiver's feelings and emotions, and how just one person, me, went through this and dealt with it.
Now that you have 14 years past David's traumatic brain injury, you have so much experience in the caregiver role. What advice would you give to other caregivers?
Well, I think that one of the biggest things that I think people need to do is accept help, because everybody is saying, "Can I help you? What can I do for you?" And for me, I didn't accept the help. I said, "Oh, I can do it. I'm good. I'm fine." And I wasn't good, fine, or anything, because I was struggling every moment with this, but I felt like I had to be strong. I didn't want other people to feel that. I didn't want to impose on other people, and I didn't want them to feel that inconvenienced, I guess. So I just never really accepted the help. Now, in retrospect, I tell people, accept that help, because it doesn't make sense not to. Your friends, your family members are offering, and they're offering genuinely, especially in the beginning they're offering, because when the incident is fresh in everybody's mind, they are all hurting as much as you are many times, and they want to be a part of the help and the progress of helping your care recipient improve. Another thing that I think might be interesting to do is, a friend of mine had this idea, and she posted a list of things to do, the things that she was going to need to do in the house or with her husband, because she was the caregiver. And she posted on a refrigerator door or something. And so when her family and friends came in, they got to know that was there, and then they would be able to say, "Hey, I can do that. I can change the flapper on your toilet today." And that would be something that would be an interesting technique to use, so that you're not actually asking for help. So that's how my friend got around it, and I think that's a wonderful idea for people to try if you are so inclined to not want to accept help. Another thing I think you need to know is to know your partner, your spouse, your other people that live with you, to know their jobs in the house. As I mentioned earlier, I knew nothing about getting money from the ATM. I knew nothing about paying bills. So I was really left hanging there because I had to learn that all by myself now, and with a lot of trial and error. I can do it now in my sleep, but I couldn't do it then. And so I think that that's really important to know what the other person does in the house to keep it running, because it'll make it a lot easier for you if you end up having to be a person that takes over. The other thing I think that is really important advice is to take time for yourself. And I feel that that is hugely important. Again, I'm giving you advice that I did not take for myself. I wish I had. And I was just so overly busy. I never was able to do that. Everything was always surrounding David, focusing on David. And so, but I think that's really important. So even if you take a walk around the block, if you read a chapter of a book, drink a cup of tea or coffee, whatever is your preference, call a friend, chat on the phone for a few minutes, vent, get it off your chest, and then you can go back and you're going to be refreshed. You can, you're kind of rebooting your computer in a way. You're re-strengthening yourself. By just those few minutes, you'll be amazed how you will feel. I often like to tell the story when I'm giving talks about holding a glass of water in your hand. Just maybe 2 ounces of water and saying, how heavy is the glass? And people look at me and like, well, it's not that heavy, it's the only thing. But I say, well, what if you're holding this glass here and you're holding it for a minute? Is it getting heavier? And they say, yeah. Well, what if you're holding it for 10 minutes? Or what if you're holding it for a day or longer? How heavy is that glass? That same 2 ounces worth of water is almost unbearable to hold. And that's like the stresses that you've got, the stresses that are building up in you. If you vent and get them out or give some release time to yourself, you'll be able to get rid of some of that stress. You'll be able to be fresher to go on to do what you need to do. So I think that that is really, really important. And then another thing I want to just tell you about is me time stones. And I'm going to just see if I can show them to you here. They're just little black polished stones. I keep them with me all the time, and I give them away, but I also keep them for me. I keep one here. This one here is mine. It's just a teeny tiny little one. There, I don't know if anyone can see it. You can't see it. Anyhow, it's just a teeny tiny little me time stone. And I keep it in pockets. In a lot of my pockets, I put all these little stones in there. So anytime I reach in, I'm thinking, oh, this is, I need to think about myself too. Maybe, go take that 5 minutes or just think about something that I like or whatever. Just something to focus on you and take the focus off of your care recipient for a few moments, because it just helps. And I have 2 quick stories about that. I gave one to a friend in the theater the other day, and she picked out I tell people they have to pick one that really resonates with them. Don't just grab a stone and just, it's got to mean something to you. So she picked one, and it almost looked like a heart. So, and she took it, and she was really serious about it. And a couple days later, I saw her again, and she goes, Donna, I have to tell you, it worked. And I said, what do you mean, Sherry? What worked? And she goes, well, I had the me time stone. I felt it. And then I thought, I really need to go take a nap. And she said, and so I did. And I was so excited because it actually worked for her. Just that little reminder made her take care of herself. She's not a caregiver, but, it's good for anybody. And then another story, I was giving a talk at a restaurant, and the waitress, I offered one to the waitress, and they were all spread around the table. There were about 20 of them out there, and I asked her, I told her what to do, and so told her she could choose one. And she hovered her hand over all the stones for about a minute or so. And then she picked one, and she said, I found the right one. She said the one that was calling her. So I think that, those are just little tips that you can use that you just have to, focus on yourself sometimes, because it'll lighten your load. It'll make your journey a little bit easier.
Prisoners Without Bars, A Caregiver's Tale is available on Amazon, and you can learn more about Donna at her website, donnafigurski.com. Thank you for the wonderful work that you do to help brain injury survivors and caregivers, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Melissa, and I have to thank you, too, for your wonderful work. I really appreciate working with you.